Hello and welcome to this special Learn with the Lords event in collaboration with the Constitution Society. Now, a constitution is a set of rules or principles which guide how a country is governed. It might be one single document, like the US Constitution, or it might be spread across lots of different places, like the UK Constitution. A little bit later on, we're going to be heading in there, the Houses of Parliament, to meet Baroness Drake, who was chair of the House of Lords Constitution Committee, and she's going to answer all your excellent questions about contemporary constitutional issues. But firstly, you're heading to Runnymede in Surrey, the site where Magna Carta was signed, and you're going to hear from Professor Andrew Blick, who's going to share a history of the UK Constitution. So for now, you're heading 23 miles that way.
Thank you, Becca. As you've heard, my name is Andrew Blick. I'm Professor of Politics and Contemporary History at King's College London and Director of the Constitution Society. You'll have seen our resource, Your Constitution, which sets out the UK political system as it works today. Now we're going to talk about how we got to where we are, looking back over more than 1,000 years of history. We're going to do this by focusing on 10 key developments. I'm here in Runnymede Meadow, Surrey, southeast England. It was here, a little over 800 years ago, that King John met with a group of his own subjects who were in rebellion against him. In order to restore peace and head off this threat to his authority, John agreed a set of limitations on his power that we know today as Magna Carta, the Great Charter. But we're going to start much earlier than that, in the Anglo-Saxon period. In this earlier era, England was divided into multiple kingdoms, and one of those kingdoms, Kent, led by King Ethelbert, who introduced a law code around about the year 610. The purpose of this law code was to prevent disagreements between different people escalating into violent conflicts. It was by setting amounts of money that people who had done some kind of harm to other people would have to pay those people. It's a very early example of an attempt to establish a system of law and a set of rules for the whole of society. So in that sense, it's a constitutional document. Magna Carta, which is Latin for Great Charter, was agreed here in this meadow, Runnymede, in June 1215. The purpose of Magna Carta, from the point of view of the then king, King John, was to stop a rebellion that his subjects had mounted against him. And the purpose of it, from the point of view of his subjects, was to get King John to agree to rule differently to the way he had up to that point. They were fed up with his oppressive, tyrannical rule, his demands for money in the form of taxes, and wanted to get him to agree to a different system of rules, a new system of rules, which is what he did here in Runnymede. When we think about Magna Carta, it's actually a source of a principle we now call the rule of law, the idea that everybody is subject to the law, even those, such as King John, who are in positions of political authority. Bits of Magna Carta still remain part of our law today, and it's become one of the most important constitutional documents and the most celebrated constitutional documents, not only here in the UK, but also around the world. Many of the episodes we're talking about today actually took place before the United Kingdom, the UK, existed as a state. And the UK has actually been made up of 4 national components: Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and England. The state of the UK came together in a series of mergers known as unions. First, Wales was incorporated legally into England by 2 acts from the 16th century. Then, in 1706, 1707, the Treaty and Acts of Union saw England and Scotland merge into what was known as the Kingdom of Great Britain. Finally, in 1800, the Act of Union saw Ireland and Great Britain become the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. For some people, rather than a series of voluntary unions, really the UK was a takeover by England of the other bits of the British Isles, and the status of the United Kingdom remains controversial up to the present day. A large part of Ireland actually left the Union in the 1920s and went on to form what is now the Republic of Ireland, leaving Northern Ireland still part of the United Kingdom. Nationalists in Northern Ireland to this day would like eventually to rejoin with the Republic of Ireland, and there are also independence movements in Scotland and in Wales, but for the time being it remains the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Most countries have what is known as a written or codified constitution, by which is meant a text setting out the core rules of the constitutional system. The UK famously lacks this kind of document. It does not have a written or codified constitution. However, historically there has been one. In 1653, Oliver Cromwell introduced what was known as the Instrument of Government, which some would say was the world's first modern written constitution. Cromwell had successfully led an uprising against King Charles I, who was removed from power and executed in 1649. In this system that didn't have a monarchy any longer, Cromwell wanted to introduce a form of political stability to replace the old system. Hence, he introduced the Instrument of Government in 1653. The document, however, didn't last very long, and in 1660 there was a restoration of the monarchy. However, this does show that there is in the past of the UK precedent for this kind of a text. Later in the 17th century, we come to the Bill of Rights, which was introduced after the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, when James II of England, or James VII of Scotland, was replaced by the joint rulers William and Mary. The purpose of the Bill of Rights was to reassure the subjects that William and Mary were going to govern differently and not perpetrate the kind of abusive, arbitrary behaviour of James II. A key feature of the Bill of Rights was strengthening the position of Parliament relative to the monarchy and making sure that monarchs couldn't just make up laws on their own without getting agreement of the whole of Parliament to them. The Bill of Rights remains relevant today. For instance, it's used to guarantee the right of freedom of speech of parliamentarians when speaking in Westminster. Parliament was getting stronger, but still only a tiny proportion of the public actually had the right to vote in elections. This changed over a period of about 100 years from 1832 onwards, when the right to vote was extended. Various public and popular campaigns such as the Chartists and the suffragists and suffragettes contributed to a series of reform acts that were passed. First, the vote was extended to more men in 1832, 1867 and 1883, and then in 1918 some women were given the right to vote in parliamentary elections. Finally, in 1928, the right to vote was given equally to all adults, women and men, and this was a crucial step in the development of democracy in the UK. As it was being elected by increasingly large sections of the population, the House of Commons began to feel that it was increasingly legitimate relative to the House of Lords, the other chamber of Parliament, that was wholly unelected. However, the House of Lords still had the ability to block legislation passed by the House of Commons. The 1911 Parliament Act came about following a series of clashes between the House of Commons, which had a Liberal majority since the general election of 1906, and the House of Lords, which had an inbuilt Conservative majority of hereditary peers. The purpose of the 1911 Act was to ensure that if it was determined to do so, the House of Commons could override the House of Lords and pass legislation even if the House of Lords didn't want to pass it. The Act also meant that the House of Lords no longer had anything to do with the raising of money, budgets, and it reduced the maximum length of a parliament, that is the gap between elections, from 7 years to 5 years. In the aftermath of the Second World War, a number of Western European countries who had previously been fighting each other on different sides, began to explore the possibility of some kind of economic and political union. The UK was initially hesitant about taking part in what is today the 27-member pan-continental European Union. Eventually, the UK did join in this project in 1973. An important constitutional aspect of it is it means that for the members, European law takes precedence, is more important than law of domestic origin. And in the UK, that meant all laws, including even acts of parliament, were subordinate to European law. The UK twice held referendums on whether it wanted to carry on being part of this project. The first referendum in 1975 produced a majority in favour of continuing to take part, but the second referendum, held in 2016, produced a leave result, and by early 2020 the UK were no longer members of the European Union. The UK has been a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights since it came into force for the first time in 1951. The Convention provides for largely what are known as civil and political rights, things like freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, and the right to a fair trial, as well as things like prohibition of torture. However, people who wanted to try and uphold their rights under the Convention initially had to go to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. They couldn't directly get those rights in the UK. The difference that the 1998 Human Rights Act made is that it incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law, which meant that UK courts were now responsible for upholding those rights on behalf of the public. The Acts of Union brought together the UK as a single state. The purpose of devolution is to give parts of the UK more control over their own affairs. The idea of devolution, or Home Rule as it was first known, first came about in the 19th century as a response to objections from Ireland about what being part of the UK meant and the way it was implemented. Eventually, devolution was applied to Northern Ireland from the 1920s through to the 1970s, but that system broke down in the context of the Troubles, a violent disagreement over what the constitutional future of Northern Ireland should be. Devolution was restored to Northern Ireland as part of a peace agreement, the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement of 1998. It was also introduced for the first time to Wales and Scotland. There had been attempts to introduce devolution in Wales and Scotland in the 1970s, which hadn't worked out. So we then had devolution introduced to Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. In all three of those territories, referendums were held on the system and the public gave their approval. Devolution has also been introduced in a much more limited extent to some parts of England. In the devolved systems, there are elected assemblies out of which governments are formed, and the kind of powers which the devolved institutions have are in areas like health and education. Other powers, such as foreign policy and security policy, are kept at or reserved at UK level. Devolution has also been introduced in much more limited extent to parts of England. It's now generally regarded as being a very well-established part of the UK Constitution. And that was a 10-minute history of the UK Constitution.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your trip to Runnymede and hearing all about the fascinating history of the UK Constitution, and a huge thank you to Professor Andrew Blick for sharing all of his amazing knowledge. You're joining me now in a House of Lords committee room in the Houses of Parliament, and we're thrilled to be joined by Baroness Drake, who's been a member of the House of Lords since 2010. So, a bit of context for you all here. When the general election was called, Parliament was soon after dissolved, and all that means is that that particular Parliament ended. When this happens, committees in both houses cease to exist until Parliament appoints or reappoints those committees. Baroness Drake was chair of the House of Lords Constitution Committee, having joined the committee in 2017 and chairing since 2021. She's going to be answering all of the excellent questions that you have submitted right here in the room where the Constitution Committee regularly held their meetings in the last Parliament. Baroness Drake, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you tell us what the purpose of the Lords Constitution Committee is and what your role is within it?
Well, I chair the Constitution Committee. I've actually been on the Constitution Committee for 6 years, but I've only actually chaired it for 3. And our job is to have representatives on that committee from all parts of the House, from the Conservatives, from the crossbenchers, from Liberal Democrats, and try and reach a consensus in producing authoritative reports for the House of Lords to consider and the House of Commons, if they wish to consider, on the constitutional implications that may arise from any bill that the government brings forward.
Thank you. How many members are on a committee?
Well, there would be around 12.
Okay, and is your job as the chair to help reach that consensus on
Yes,
these issues?
it is.
So linked to that, what inquiries had the Constitution Committee been working on before the last Parliament was dissolved?
Well, several, but I'll highlight 3. One was the rule of law and the role of the law officers, because I don't know if all of your students will remember, but following the referendum on Brexit and the decision to leave the EU, there was a lot of controversy about how that was done, how it was implemented, how agreements that were reached with the EU were subsequently honoured or not honoured. So there was lots of controversy about, governments upholding the rule of law and the rule of international law. There was arguments about the independence of the judiciary, because sometimes they overrule decisions of government ministers. And there was lots of controversy around the conduct of, or the role of, the law officers, in particular the Attorney Generals who give advice to government, and the Lord Chancellor who's supposed to defend, he or she is supposed to defend the independence of the judiciary. So that was a very big study that we undertook to set out quite clearly what the rules of law were, what the roles of the different parties were, what the obligations were in honouring the law, and what were the role of the courts. And that was very well received as quite an authoritative document, and has actually proved a bit of a reference document. So some of the students and their teachers may benefit for dipping into that document as probably a contemporary source of these issues. Another one that we looked at was when the government introduced the requirement for voters going to vote to take a identification with them, and it wasn't any identification, it was identification as listed by the government. And the preliminary evidence that was emerging from the first set of local elections was that quite a few people didn't get to vote. Either they didn't have the requisite ID that was prescribed, or they turned up and they didn't know, and then it was too late, and they couldn't get back later in that day, or a range of other barriers that operated to stop people participating. That's not to sort of challenge the integrity of the whole electoral system, because for the majority of people it went very smoothly. But it was a significant enough a number of people who were impacted. And remember, we operate on a system that everybody who's eligible to vote should be able to vote. So we looked into that, and we said there were weaknesses around the administration of voter identification for those participating. And also, because of the evidence that we took, particularly from the electoral administrators, who basically carry the weight of this electoral system on their shoulders, they were describing to us some of the wider strains in the electoral system that was now being placed, and that they were worried that if governments just kept adding more and more changes without making sure the underlying system was robust, there could be problems. So we produced that report, and actually the government has picked up in their King's Speech some suggested amendments to the way in which the electoral system works. And the one we're looking at the moment is the devolution settlement, because obviously that was a huge constitutional change for the country with the setting up of devolved governments. And about 3 or 4 years ago, the Constitution Committee looked at this in some detail and produced quite an authoritative report about the strains and stresses in the relationships between the devolved parliaments and governments and Westminster and Whitehall. And we put a series of proposals for how those relationships could be improved. And we used 2 key words, respect and cooperation, that each had to respect the other's role, because there was this tension of where were the boundaries of legitimacy for each group. And there must be a more formalised way and more engaged way of ministers from Wales and Scotland or civil servants engaging. And we've been doing a follow-up. We haven't completed yet because the dissolution of Parliament intervened, but hopefully we can move on to completing it. Reviewing what has improved since we last looked at it and what further measures can be taken, because devolution is a very important part of the constitutional settlement now, and we saw it put under stress because during COVID each country in the nation were doing different things, as people remember, and also during Brexit a lot of powers were brought back from Europe to the UK, and they came straight into Westminster and Whitehall. And of course the devolved governments were saying, well, hang on, we had those powers when we were in the EU, you've taken them more to the centre. So there was a lot of tension there. So that's why we thought we'd have another look at it.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll pick up on some of the points you've made a little bit later in some of the questions. So thank you so much for that. So we'll move on to some questions now submitted by all of you watching today. So we've just learned all about the history of the Constitution from Professor Andrew and the pivotal events of 1215. Eden Girls' School in Slough would like to know if you feel that Magna Carta continues to be relevant today.
Well, yes, in the sense that it's part of our history, but things have moved on a great deal since the Magna Carta, so we can't over-rely on it for informing our constitution. But it did 2 or 3 really important things. It established the concept of the rule of law. It established the habeas corpus principle that you couldn't be seized without good legitimate reason for that, and that one could have access to court to be heard, and it qualified absolute power on that occasion, the absolute power of the king. And what it did, it started the process of building a more consensus-based constitution, and over the years we've seen that evolve in the UK.
Absolutely, thank you so much. So to move on to some questions related to the Constitution today, Bromley High School, Strode's College and South Devon College would like to know if the UK would benefit from having a codified constitution.
Well, this is an issue that's currently a lot more debated than it used to be, probably because some of the tensions that we've seen in our society in recent years. But I suspect the majority view is still that an uncodified constitution is better for the UK. One, because it allows flexibility. So rather than a huge problem or a political crisis creating an eruption, the constitution is flexible enough that Parliament and government can adapt and respond to a crisis or a stress or a tension in society, where a codified constitution makes that much more problematic. It means we are more able to respond to changing circumstances, where it's easier to contemporize our constitution. So things like equality and human rights are now much, much bigger within the central thinking of our constitution, and we can adapt those. And also, some would argue it's more democratic, because often codified constitutions were written as historic documents, whereas the world has changed, and the current generation or population might want their constitutions amended, and it allows for more pragmatic government. And the argument is that pragmatic government doesn't lead to revolutions or big confrontations. It doesn't mean you don't have tensions, but not that sort of ultimate confrontation. So I think for me, the balance of the argument lies with an uncodified constitution. And I think a rather good example is the American Constitution, where the right to bear arms is highly codified in their constitution, and it's a very high barrier to change that constitution. So whereas there's quite a bit of public sentiment to sort of saying there's too much bearing of arms in America, it's much, much more difficult for them to change that constitutional right to bear arms, whereas we would have more flexibility.
That's great, thank you. That's a great example. So to follow up, linked to that one, St Edmund Campion School in Birmingham and Strode's College again would like to know if you feel that rights are adequately protected in the UK's uncodified constitution.
Individual rights?
Yes.
Well, they're protected in a range of ways. They're protected by common law, they're protected by statute, and individual pieces of legislation. I think the current popular or stressed debate on, it's right across Europe, not just in the UK, on the level of immigration and illegal immigration has brought the whole issue of individual rights into tension, because, you know, who has individual rights and who should be denied individual rights. And for the first time, we saw a government suspend particular articles of the Human Rights Act, which hadn't happened before. And that was in response to the Immigration Act and in response to the Rwanda Act. And the intention was that those who had not entered the country legally couldn't have access to the courts to argue a human right case before the court, and that the court should not have the jurisdiction to hear those, and this was to be part of the deterrent in the process. But that did upset quite a lot of people, because behind that pragmatic desire to deal with illegal immigration was the constitutional precedent that a government could just, for a reason of policy, suspend human rights. So there was a tension, and it was quite a heated debate in the House of Lords, and arguments around, well, you know, sometimes illegal immigrants will have counterbalancing arguments. For example, those people in Afghanistan who had worked with the British Army and who hadn't got out, you know, if their only route was an illegal route, does that mean they would be banished from the UK? If people had been trafficked for sex purposes and managed to break free, did that mean they couldn't pursue their human rights? So there was a sort of concern about what precedents were we setting around human rights. But I think overall, I do have great faith in the British Constitution, and fundamentally, I do believe that in terms of international comparisons, that our framework of individual and human rights and the way in which our judiciary approach those issues, they're pretty safe.
Thank you. New College Doncaster asked why we uphold a monarchical system when the monarch has no political power within our constitution.
Well, it's evolved as a part of our constitutional settlement. Countries need a head of state, and in that sense, the monarch, King Charles, occupies that role. We don't have a president. The UK has chosen not to have a president, and having a president is quite significant because it would take powers to a president that currently may lie in Parliament, because under the UK Constitution, the most supreme body is Parliament. Parliament is sovereign. And also, we don't elect our Prime Minister. We elect parties, and it's the party with the majority of seats who then take their leader, or whoever they choose as their leader, to be the Prime Minister, although that's obviously with the consent of Parliament. And as we've seen over the last 8 or 9 years, Prime Ministers can be changed by Parliament. You don't have to have a fresh constitution, a fresh election to change your Prime Minister, and Prime Ministers aren't directly elected. So there is a role for the head of state, and that role is vested in the King. And I think if you change from that, you'd start to raise questions about the sovereignty of our parliamentary process and possibly shifting powers to a different form of head of state or president. So we have settled by evolution to where we are, and some people will argue that they would prefer a Republican settlement, and they don't like being regarded as being covered by a monarchy. But I think if one sits back and looks at the whole system holistically, actually the monarch as a head of state is a good fit with the balance of powers between our different political institutions, the sovereignty of Parliament in particular.
Great, thank you very much. Archbishop's Holgate School in York asked what you feel has been the most influential constitutional reform in recent history.
Well, the last decade or so of British history, constitutional changes have been quite significant. Obviously, devolution has been a major constitutional settlement, and I think possibly when the settlement was first done, people didn't necessarily anticipate how it would evolve. And actually, the demand for devolved power and devolved government is growing. So now, as we're seeing with the some of the mayors, there's a call to devolve more power in England, because there's a sense of, in certain areas, devolved power empowers the local community, more progress can be made. So I think the devolution settlement has been huge. The withdrawal from the EU, because going into the EU was a constitutional settlement, coming out of it was a constitutional variation, and in some ways we're still living through the consequences of that decision. So probably, but I don't really want to create too much of a hierarchy, but insofar as I'm being asked to reflect on two that I think have reverberated through our country, I would probably pick up devolution and the withdrawal from the EU.
Thank you so much for that, and great question there from Archbishop Holgate, thank you. So, Chancellor's School in Hertfordshire argue that the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty is central to the UK's constitutional arrangements, which you mentioned a bit earlier. They ask, how far do you feel that constitutional reforms over the last 30 years have genuinely empowered Parliament?
Well, I think parliamentary sovereignty is alive and well, and I think I've used the example before, but I don't think you can change your Prime Minister 4 times or 3 times without an election, without having parliamentary sovereignty. So that's the case, most obvious manifestations. But it has been put under stress. There is no doubt about that. And that's because I think in recent times that a lot of the conventions that have underpinned our constitution, or some of the key aspects of law that have underpinned our constitution, have been subject to legislative change. And I think that has rather shifted power to the cabinet and the executive away from Parliament. And I'm not sure all members of Parliament, how can I put it, that they're obviously loyal to their own party and to their own party in power, but actually holding to the principle of parliamentary sovereignty is absolutely key to our constitutional settlement. And actually, that's how the Supreme Court sees it. If you listen to the President of the Supreme Court, who has spent a lot of time engaging with MPs and the public generally to explain the role of the Supreme Court, that part of their role is to protect parliamentary sovereignty. And they're very keen and acute in their view that that is one of their roles. So I think in part it's down to Parliament to determine how it wants to exercise that parliamentary sovereignty. But I think it has been put under stress because some of the challenges, not least of which dealing with the consequences of Brexit, has tended to concentrate more power in the executive. So it's been put under stress, but I don't think it's lost.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So, the Thomas Hardy School in Dorchester is an interesting one. They'd like to know what the arguments are in favour and against introducing citizens' assemblies as a third House of Parliament.
We have a lot of parliaments in the UK. We have one in Wales, we have one in Scotland, Northern Ireland, we have Westminster, each of whom have powers and responsibilities. We have a House of Lords, and there is much discussion about reforming that House of Lords. I think we have to be a little careful about how many assemblies or parliaments we build, because you have to go back to the parliamentary sovereignty point that we are a parliament of elected representatives whose job is to look after the interests of the people in the nation. And you can, if you go too far in having too many assemblies, just create tension between where power lies and how consensus and agreement is reached on moving forward. Secondly, when Parliament is elected, every citizen is entitled to go and vote as long as they've reached the qualifying conditions, and therefore there's a universal suffrage. It's the product of the universal vote cast by the country. And I just worry a little bit that sometimes citizens' assemblies won't have that same legitimacy because they've not been created through that universal suffrage system, and also they probably involve people who are most articulate, almost wanting to get engaged. So involving the citizens is absolutely key to our constitutional settlement, but I'm not sure the citizens' assemblies are necessarily, or creating them into a third House of Parliament is the way forward, because I think there's going to be an awful large number of parliaments having to resolve between themselves how power is exercised. So I wouldn't make them another House of Parliament.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Devonport High School in Plymouth ask, given the increasing calls for greater devolution, as you were just mentioning, and even independence from nations such as Scotland and Wales, what steps do you think the UK government could take to address these demands whilst maintaining constitutional stability and unity?
Right. Well, hello to Devonport High School. I was born and raised in Devonport in the early stages of my life, and my aunt went to Devonport High School, hence my name Drake. So thank you for your question. Well, I think I'd answer that question in three parts, actually. Undoubtedly, there is a mood within the political system and the population in this country to get more power devolved to those communities impacted by that power as far as is possible, without undermining the sort of integrity of the national political settlement. And I think we're going to see more devolution of power coming in the UK when we look at what we've seen develop in Manchester with the mayors and in East Midlands, which has proved to deliver good results. Then there is, I think, a momentum to move towards proportionately devolving power so these communities can improve their life chances, their economic chances, and have greater control over their own futures. So I think that decentralisation of power from Westminster and Whitehall will grow, and I think it'll be, as long as there's clarity of purpose and resources, it will deliver a better settlement for UK citizens. When one looks at the existing devolution settlements, Northern Ireland is a little bit different because of the history, the long history of the Northern Ireland and the Irish settlement. In Wales and Scotland, there have been tensions around how the devolution settlement has operated. As, I think people in Scotland and Wales have felt that actually central governments and Westminster may not have treated them with the respect or involved them or engaged with them to the extent that is desirable. And that's been one of the issues that we've been looking at the Constitution Committee. But in Scotland, I mean, you did have a dominant party, the Scottish Nationalist Party, who wanted to be an independent nation. So where you have a party who want to be an independent nation, then in a way, when you're offering cooperation, that's never going to completely satisfy, because the settlement they want is not to be part of the country. So probably there's a bigger challenge there, getting effective working relationships going in Scotland. But the government has a duty to meet the needs of all of its citizens, and it has to work on getting a constructive relationship with Wales and Scotland. I mean, at the end of the day, the Westminster Parliament is sovereign. I think that's the right principle, because at the end of the day, there is a concept of national interest, and you have to have a body that is capable of responding flexibly and sensibly to the national interests of the country. But within that constraint, I think the mood to devolve more power and allow countries to, different communities to empower themselves will grow.
So South Devon College and the Charter School in London would like to know what, if anything, is the most needed reform to the UK Constitution, so it can pick up on themes we've discussed earlier, such as devolution, maybe electoral reform or House of Lords reform.
Well, I mean, we now have a new government and a King's speech has been delivered, so they have identified their constitutional priorities in this area. And obviously one of those is in the House of Lords. There's some immediate proposals to reduce the size of the House of Lords, because there is a feeling, understandably, that the House of Lords is too large, and they want to kind of set a pace on reducing that. And the two ways in which they have been immediately opposed is removing the remaining 92 hereditary peers, and also having a retirement age at 80. Now I know probably most of the listeners thinking anybody beyond 40 is over the hill. Anybody at 60 is way past it, and anybody at 80 sitting in the House of Lords is ridiculous. But actually, you do have some amazing ex-Supreme Court judges, leading counsel, scientists, medics, who are very cerebrally functioning. So I wouldn't want to overgeneralise about the capacity. But nonetheless, there is a view of this government that there should be a retirement age of 80, and also raising the standard, I think, because it was perceived over the last few years that the appointment of some of the peers have been a bit too loose and political, that there's a need to tighten the kind of appointments process. So I think we'll expect to see changes there. The fundamental issue, which of course I think is probably a second term issue, second term of government, is what do you do with the powers of the House of Lords itself? Because at the moment it's a scrutiny body, which means it literally goes through every piece of legislation, every piece of statutory instrument. policy documents and scrutinises them and writes reports or comes up with comment. And actually that's a very valuable function, and actually governments rely on it. They often will look to the House of Lords to go through something in a great detail and say, well, this is a weakness, this is a strength, modify this or modify that. If you make, and it's not for me, I'm not an elected MP, it is for the Commons to decide. They have the mandate. It's not for me to decide. And I will respect whatever decision that the House of Commons reach. But if they do have an elected second chamber, then the tension that always arises is what will their power be in relation to Parliament's power, which is sovereign. Because once you have a second chamber, a bit like the House of Representatives and the Senate in America, the second chamber says, well, we have an electoral mandate. You can't override us. Whereas with the House of Lords, we can't stop anything the government want. We might sort of delay it for a bit. And there are areas of government activity like finance bills, anything to do with budgets or money, we're not allowed to touch. And that's always the one that creates the problem. It's always the one at the end of the day that gets people, well, we're not quite ready to go. So I think that big issue of as and when the government are ready to say, well, we're going to completely radically change the role of the House of Lords and have it as an elected chamber, it has to answer the question of where the balance of power lies between the existing Parliament and a new elected chamber. The electoral reform is in the government's manifesto, the voting age at 16, things like voter ID and other stresses and strains in the electoral system, just reviewing to make sure we're not creating new barriers to people participating in elections. So I think that the whole registration for voting, donations to political parties, I think a lot of these areas the government are proposing to look at. The other one, devolution, I think I come back to the point I've already covered about devolving greater power in England. That's partly related to the drive for more economic growth, that actually if you want the economies all around the country, all of the country to benefit from the drive and not just certain regions, then there's a sort of a growing belief you have to devolve greater powers to parts of the UK.
Brilliant, thank you so much for that really comprehensive answer, which covers questions from lots of schools watching today, including Richard Hale School in Hertford, Wolseley Hall, Oxford Home Schooling Group and St Catherine's School in Surrey. So thank you for submitting questions about House of Lords reform. So that brings us to our final question today, and this is to circle back to your role as chair of the Constitution Committee and more about your personal experience of that role. Bolton Sixth Form College would like to ask what has been the most challenging and rewarding part of that role.
Well, the most challenging role as chair, if you sit as a member, then you express your view. The most challenging role as chair is to reach a consensus across everybody who participates in the Constitution Committee. And remember, we come from every political party. Authoritative Constitution report that has minority views or split views isn't really a value, that we carry a responsibility to really drill down and assess if and when we think there are constitutional implications, what they are, and invite Parliament to address them. So I think literally working, preparing and facilitating, I think I'm quite a patient person, facilitating what is necessary to reach a consensus position on any constitutional report. Passions of mine, I believe passionately in the independence of the judiciary. I think the rule of law as we know it, it can't operate effectively without an independent judiciary. In a way, you know, all of us, the students listening, are all very young. They've got exciting lives to come, and if they're going to go into politics, you'll have ups and downs, but it is exciting. But you want to make a contribution to the quality of your country's democracy. We're a very lucky country relative to others. Sometimes we don't appreciate the freedoms that we have and the stability we have in our democracy, like we've just seen, where you can change from one government to another quite seamlessly without a great deal of contest, because there's a legitimacy in the whole process. And we, those of us who are older, have an obligation to defend that democracy for those coming along, and therefore being on the ball and being willing to say, call out something that is constitutionally harmful to that wonderful democratic freedom of Britain. We should do.
Thank you so much. So a huge thank you to Baroness Drake for joining us today and answering all of your excellent questions. And thank you for submitting such brilliant questions as well. We'd love to know what you thought of today's event. So if you would like to fill in the survey that we're dropping into the chat at the moment, teachers, we'd love to hear your thoughts as we plan future Learn with the Lord sessions and events. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.